What's going on, guys and gals? Jonathan Shane, functional nutritional therapy practitioner, specializing in metabolic health, low carb, endurance, and performance. Today, where carnivore goes wrong for runners. So, as we know, carnivore is a popular thing right now. Keto, even though it's considered a fad diet by the Western culture, we know it's not. We know that it's running by storm. It's been running by storm since like 2018. It's great. Okay, so, but you know me. I'm unbiased. I'm non-dogmatic. I call the crap where it is. Sometimes it gets me in trouble on both sides of the aisle. I don't care. So today we're going to talk about when keto, per se, can go wrong for athletes. Now, caveat here, right? I am a runner. I am a hybrid athlete. I've done some bodybuilding. I don't specialize in bodybuilding. I'm never going to claim that. I definitely can say that I run competitively as a runner, and I compete competitively as a hybrid athlete. Competing in high rocks, I've ran multiple 50s. I've podiumed at multiple 50s. So it's something that I know. It's something that I know well. It's something that I train hundreds of men and women to do. Okay, so that is my place where I'm coming from. So that all being said, when does it go wrong? We first have to understand where it's not an issue, right? So muscle building, specifically strength training. There is no data that indicates that carbohydrates isolated improve muscle growth and overall performance. Now, there are studies that look at literature of more carbohydrates in a diet versus low carb, and they do show that the carbs in those kinds of instances do produce better muscle protein synthesis, recovery, and overall performance. However, there's no studies done on control groups that are what we know as fat adapted. The only closest thing we have to that is the FASTER study, and that looked at endurance athletes, and they replenished glycogen almost as quickly, if not as quickly, as their high carb counterparts. Now, it's not to say that a high carb diet necessarily is bad for muscle growth, and this is specifically what we're talking about. We can talk about if a high carb diet is bad for other things. But specifically, I'm not saying that high carb diets are bad for muscle growth. What I am saying is that there's no clinical evidence that a ketogenic diet, when we're looking at muscle mass development, is bad for muscle growth and performance. Okay. Now, that being said, taking out a clinical, looking at anecdotal. Anecdotally speaking, I've never seen evidence of that. If you eat enough protein and you stimulate your muscle well, you're going to put on muscle, right? If you eat enough protein and you stimulate your muscle, you're going to go muscle. Now, the amount of calories you're eating will help dictate whether that's a slow growth, right? If you're in a deficit and you're eating a lot of protein, muscle mass growth is going to be much slower. If the deficit is too steep, it's going to be almost non-existent. You may even lose some simply because your body's going to be using that protein to try and survive. If you're at maintenance calories or you're in a surplus, obviously you're going to have those extra resources in order to put on muscle. So again, when it comes to muscle growth, a carnivorous diet and a ketogenic diet are not bad. In fact, for some people, it may be better specifically for this reason. A lot of people on a higher carb diet or standard, if it fits your macros diet, have a hard time getting in enough protein because they don't have the stomach room. Maybe they have gastric bypass. Maybe they just have not a lot of dispensability, which is your stomach's ability to stretch. And so their meal portions are smaller. They're filling it with carbohydrates. So they're not really relying on denser, more calorie-dense foods. And so they have a hard time getting in enough protein. So going on a carnivorous diet or a low-carb ketogenic diet, focusing more on animal meats, significantly increases their protein. So for some people, that alone is the reason why you grow more muscle on a carnivorous diet. You just get in way more protein than you used to. And it's pretty normal on a carnivorous diet to not track macros, right? That's one of the highlights of it, if you will. And so you may not even notice that. You just know you're eating more meat. But that's why muscle growth can even be much more noticeable for some people on a carnivorous, low-carb, ketogenic diet. It's because of, again, just the inherent change in protein macro ratios. And so, again, for muscle growth, a carnivorous ketogenic diet is not bad at all. There's no evidence that it hinders performance at all, especially after fat adaptation. Again, there's not a lot of clinical data on that, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence. There's plenty. I mean, there's going to be people comment on this video that are going to be good anecdotal markers for this, right? Felt crap eating Lucky Charms, feel great eating steak and eggs. We see it time and time again, right? So again, when it comes to muscle growth, there's no inherent data that really tells us that a fat adapted person on a higher protein carnivore ketogenic diet is hindered when it comes to muscle development and strength and overall gym performance. Okay, let's jump to the next. Let's go moderate intensity. Let's talk CrossFit. Let's talk HIIT workouts. Depends on the person. Depends on the person when we're talking about carnivore ketogenic diets. Why? Because while some people are fat adapted, in fact, you could have a whole pool of people that are fat adapted. There are different genetic pathways. There are different things. We know that there are genetic genes that allow your body to metabolize fat faster than other people. We see this in a lot of low carb endurance athletes. You have people that have been training just as long as Zach Bitter, but Zach Bitter can metabolize a ridiculous amount of fatty acids. And some of that is genetic. Some of that's performance, some of that's nutrition, some of that is genetic, okay? So you have people that are really good at metabolizing fatty acids, like really good, not just from like a nutritional standpoint, but genetically, they're gifted at it. People that tend to be leaner tend to have a higher fatty metabolism, even if they're not what we would call incarnately fat adapted yet, right? They're doing more of a high carb diet, but when they go on a deficit, their body just eats fat, just eats it. It's just good at it, right? Those kinds of people, generally, they burn enough fat, they create enough ATP. It's not as stressful on their body where they can replenish glycogen and get through, a 30-minute CrossFit session or a 30-minute HIIT session. No problem, no questions asked. I've seen plenty of carnivore CrossFit athletes, right? However, not everybody's like that. Some people need a little bit of carbohydrates to do something that intense for that long of a duration due to their body's adaptive abilities. Adaptative, that's not a word, but adaptation, right? Their ability to metabolize fatty acids at a very quick rate for ATP. Now, some caveats: if you really want to avoid carbs, you could try having some ketones before. You could try some of my pre-workout right there, the True Endurance. I'll put that link in the comment section. There's other things you can try before you go to carbs, but I've also often found that some people, especially women, right, when we're talking about the stress impact of things like CrossFit, if you're really into that, or like Orange Theory or F45, those kind of like quick pace, intense duration type workouts, just because it's more endurance inclined, you're going to be using a little bit more glycogen and your body can tap out. And so again, that's a situation where it depends on the person, right? So option A, yes, muscle building for sure. More HIIT based CrossFit interval like training depends on the person. Okay, now we get into the third realm, which is endurance: running, cycling, swimming, etc. Okay, this one, it depends on the kind of training, right? So not necessarily the person, but the training, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean that when we are doing mostly zone 2 endurance, right? So lower heart rate, right? Really sitting in that fatty metabolism. You're not really tapping into a lot of glycogen. Most people, if they're fat adapted, can handle zone 2 just fine. In fact, what they'll notice is they complement each other really well. It's part of what I go through in my 3 phases of the fat fueled system with my athletes and my clients that are just trying to get healthy and get fit. Your body gets complemented with that diet. The ketogenic low carb carnivorous diet paired with good low effort zone 2 training. So almost anybody can pull that off. I always tell people all the time, most people, if their goal is to run a marathon completely fasted, you can do it. You can definitely do it. You don't need carbs in order to run a marathon if you train well for it, okay? So again, low intensity training, fat adaptation, no carbs needed, totally fine, okay? Now, we get into higher efforts. Let's say that you want to be competitive. You want to run a low zone 3 during a marathon. You want to run a high zone 3, low zone 4 during your half. You want to run a high zone 4 during your 10 and 5Ks. Now we're having a different discussion, because even if you're fat adapted, you're still tapping into glycogen. And glycogen, to be replenished, is a stressful thing for your body, even if it gets efficient at it. And also endurance training for a long amount of time and the intensity as it increases also brings in more stress, okay? So when that comes in, the only thing we know, clinically speaking, that suppresses cortisol isocalorically, meaning absent of calorie amount, are carbohydrates because of their impact on insulin and its relationship to your cortisol levels, okay? So that is a time when carbohydrates for 99% of the population is needed. Now, there are people, like there is a doctor from Harvard, I believe, that qualified for Boston on a carnivore diet. That's great. That's one. It's good for the movement, right? But in general, most people can't pull that off, right? Most people can't pull that off. because the stress on your hormones, and again, especially when we're like, and then we're getting into the nuance of like men versus women with their cycles and the stress of that, plus on top of that, the stress of the training, plus on top of that, the stress of recovery. Carbohydrates can be a major beneficial factor when it comes to training, preparing, and optimizing for your races. And overall, more intense training, right? Now, again, I know people that have ran 100 miles fasted, but if you ask them what their heart rate was, it was 110 beats per minute for sure. And that same person will go run a 100, 200 mile race and they'll win it, but their heart rate was a bit higher, probably 10, 15 beats per minute higher, and they were ingesting carbs during that competitive session. So kind of just to recap this all, to build muscle, you don't need carbohydrates. Isolated, you don't need carbohydrates. If you're doing intense training, right, it really depends on the person, depending on their genetics, their gender, all that jazz. When it comes to endurance training, it depends on the intensity of the training and your overall goals. All that to say, on top of that extra layer, again, of going back to men versus women, women might find, due to hormone cycle, stress, things like that, they need some carbohydrates to build muscle. Not because they need it to build, it's not a tool for them to build the muscle, but it's a tool to keep their hormones better regulated so that they're more anabolic and so that they have the energy to perform well in the gym. Right, so then we get in that nuance when it comes to the different genders there, when it comes to nutrition protocols. So all that to say, it depends. It depends. It doesn't always go wrong, but it can go wrong. And it's important to understand that if your goal is overall fitness and performance and not necessarily just fat loss or, touting on Instagram that you've only eaten steak for 5 years. That's not your goal. Your goal is to be in the best shape of your life. You might find that adding in some honey, maple syrup, you can do tubers, fruits, whatever it may be, during intense training sessions and intense training weeks can be a game changer for you. So that's all I have to say about that. If you have any comments, put it in the comment section. If you have any questions, let me know. If you want a plan, if you want to figure yourself out, I have free consultation calls. Schedule a call. Let's chat. I'll see you on the other side.